everybody. I'm Wendy Bawabe. I know it's hard to pronounce. I'm president of the Norwell Historical Society, and like Zoe said, I'm on the cemetery committee in town too. And I'm actually done with the cemetery committee. I have, my term is up on Friday. Don't mean to sound like I'm counting the days, but I am a little bit, because it's a little stressful committee. So years ago, I started working with, I wasn't on the cemetery committee at the time, I started working with the former chair of the cemetery committee. I'm sure a lot of you know her, Gertrude Danow. And Gertrude and I were working on a brochure that gave people a self-driving tour of the historic cemeteries in Norwell. And from that brochure has come this presentation. So I want to say that I am the mere photographer, and I've got information in my hand, so I can give you some information, but the real knowledge is going to come from Stephen. So I'm going to turn to Stephen a lot, because he's got the real knowledge, and he's going to let you know what the real information is. So, like I said, this was the brochure that Gert and I worked on together. And so tonight we're going to talk about 8 historic cemeteries in town, 2 historic graveyards that aren't even visible. You won't even know where they are. They don't have any stones anymore. And 3 historic grave sites, or 1 historic grave site on private property, and then a couple of private burial grounds and tombs. And like I said, we're going to update this brochure. We've got to still work on that. So first we're going to start with the 8 historic cemeteries in town. They are all publicly accessible or viewable from the road. So any of these that you want to visit after this virtual tour, you can go ahead and visit. So the first one, so that everybody knows, right in the center of Norwell. It was established in 1725 when the town of Scituate, so in 1725, of course, Norwell was part of Scituate, set aside some land on Herringbrook Hill for the 2nd parish, which is the 2nd parish of Scituate today, the 1st parish of Norwell, to set up a training ground and a training field and a burial ground. So it was actually a training field for troops and also burial ground. And in 1908, the lot holders purchased the cemetery and the adjacent tomb yard from the church for $1. And since that time, the cemetery has actually been privately owned. It's not owned by First Parish, and it's privately owned by a private nonprofit corporation called the First Parish Cemetery Association. And I'm now going to put a little plug in for the First Parish Cemetery Association. It's a small nonprofit group that relies on funds, donations from private citizens. There are a couple of endowments that they also pull from, but they need to maintain the cemetery in perpetuity. So they have a brand new website, firstparishcemeterynorwell.org. So if anybody wants to get on that, you can donate there, or you can just view some of the notable gravestones. So I'm going to go over some of the notable gravestones also. So this stone is actually, it's the Merritt family stone. And Joseph Merritt wrote a book called The History of South Scituate and Norwell. So he kind of wrote the book on the town. And his aunt, I believe,
I think so.
Her name is Helen Foster Merritt, and that's a photograph of her. She's also buried here. She, the last large ship built on a shipyard on the North River, on a Norwell shipyard, was named the Helen M. Foster. It was before she got married to Mr. Merritt, and it was named after her. This is the James family plot, so as in the James Library. They lived on Main Street, and they were the owners of the Blockhouse shipyard. And this is where I'm going to bring Stephen in, because he's going to talk a little bit about, in particular, William James's absolutely gorgeous marble stone, which the CPA funds, the Community Preservation Act funds, the town of Norwell at this past town meeting actually authorized more money for First Parish Cemetery Association to redo stones, and this is one of the stones. In fact, all the James family stones are going to be redone. This, in real life right now, looks kind of burgundy color. There's a little glare in that picture, and it is white marble. absolutely white marble. And it's an interesting stone too, sorry Stephen, but it's actually two pieces. The base isn't marble, and there are these pins, these metal pins that hold that top piece onto the base that go all through the stone, and they have over the years rusted. Even though they're stainless steel, they have rusted. So it's interesting, the company that's redoing the stones is actually going to put a fiberglass pin, two fiberglass pins in it to hold the stones upright. I thought that was fascinating. So Stephen, do you want to tell us a little bit about the James stone?
Sure. One of the things too that's amazing with the burying grounds and cemeteries around here is the type and quality of stones that we have. There are all sorts of grave markers, and once you get a little bit familiar with a lot of the cemeteries throughout southeastern Massachusetts, you'll be able to, what I like to call, read a cemetery just by looking over and seeing what types of stones. As Wendy said, this is a beautiful marble. He's died in 1854. You've got that wonderful Gothic arch up top, and you've got the wonderful flowers, the cut flowers, a traditional image of beauty that has been cut down and about to die. That's in literature, it's in a lot of iconography, in paintings, engravings, and you see that on here. And like Wendy said, it's got a granite base and then the marble is on top. Marble gravestones started to appear around 1810. Those are some of the earliest dates. Marble quarries out in Western Mass and New Hampshire supplied the marble that were most popular from about 1820 to about 1870, and that's when you get these wonderful marble gravestones of all different types and varieties. Some of them have elaborate carvings, such as the Gothic arch. Some of them have imagery like flowers, like Masonic emblems, like other images like a hand pointing upward. There's a whole vocabulary of what's carved on these stones. Prior to, and then a little bit later on, we get the granite monuments, mostly Quincy granite. Around here, I think we're on the 6th generation of Barnacote family down in Middleborough, still making gravestones, in the same tradition as their great-great-grandfather. And then you get the sort of modern stones. Now, as we go through tonight, notice the materials, notice the language on the stones, and the types of carving. As we go through, I'll talk about the materials and talk about the imagery that you'll be able to find on some of these stones.
And Stephen mentioned all the different, I'm just going to go back. If you look at each one is different of these James stones. They all have a different carving. I'm going to be so excited. The guy's actually starting soon. And he's going to clean all these stones. They're going to look night and day different from how they look now. And I think we're going to have a James enacted at the cemetery tour. I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so this is another, and if you notice this little gravestone down the bottom, that's a reminder to me that Stephen needs to talk. So this is the Delano family, were a family of shipbuilders. They lived along along River Street mostly. And this is the Delano family tomb at First Parish. Go ahead, Stephen.
It's sort of like a vaudeville act, The Delano family, of course, is very prominent around here. They come from Philip Delanois, an immigrant on one of the first ships to Duxbury back in the 1620s. This type of tomb, these vaults, start to appear around 1790, 1800 in this area. What you have here is that door leads to literally a granite room underground, sort of backed up into the side of the hill. You'll see these around in a lot of the cemeteries. Sometimes you'll see them as little family plots. There's one similar up on Old Oak and Bucket. What these were designed are sort of above ground family plots. These date, like I said, from the early 19th century when the granite industry up in Quincy was really taking off. These are massive granite boulders. And inside, there's usually either some shelves on the side for putting the coffins, or sometimes if it's fairly simple, you just sort of stack the coffins up. These replicate burial vaults. If you ever get the chance, I highly recommend either Old North Church up in Boston or King's Chapel. You can do a tour of the burial vaults down below in the crypt. This was only done by Anglican or Episcopalian churches up until the early 19th century, where you had in-church burials. Most of the congregational churches, Baptist churches, didn't have that. But you can see how these rooms were constructed. Prior to that, you had vaults that were literally just shafts underground. The Granary Burying Ground up in Boston, where Paul Revere, Sam Adams, and John Hancock are buried, there are numbered vaults all around the side, or little granite or brick like blocks up on top. They mark an underground vault. Those are fairly expensive, so you find them only in the 18th century in wealthier towns like Boston. It's unfortunate that a lot of them have been lost, particularly at the Granary. A couple of years ago, a unsuspecting tourist actually fell into one and discovered one. But these were sort of the rural equivalent of those early vaults. And with Quincy being so close, the granite could be moved fairly easily by train in the mid-19th century or by ox cart before that. But it's still a massive undertaking. But it also reflects the idea of keeping the family together. And a vault like this could hold 15, 20, maybe 25 members of the family.
Do you think, question for you, Stephen, was it about trying to, I don't want to say show off, but you know what I mean, be a little ostentatious for the Delanos? Or do you think there was a fear of being underground? Or do you think it had more to do with
I think it's, well, like anything, some people wanted to show off. You know, they could afford something much nicer, much larger. If you ever go up to Mount Auburn up in Cambridge, that cemetery, you know, there's massive markers for many families, you know, vaults with like statues in them. This is sort of the, like I said, rural equivalent. I don't think it's a fear of being underground or anything. I think it's just one other way to sort of take care of the family. I can remember hearing a story many, many years ago down in the Plimpton Common Burying Ground, right in Plimpton Center. There's a little vault for the Soule family. And I heard a story about 30 years ago from somebody who had been in town for many years. And he said as a boy, he saw the last of the Soules, the last family member, actually in the vault making space for himself. You know, he was a real old timer and he was just waiting to join the rest of the family. So this is, you know, just one of those ways that the culture and society at the time wanted to keep everyone buried together.
I have questions too, so.
Will this get cleared up? Because there was all that mold on the top. Will that also get cleared up?
So, you know, that's not going to be cleaned. That's not on the docket to be cleaned. And I don't think that lichen hurts it. It's just, yeah, it's just the lichen. And it was funny, was it you that was saying that since acid rain is better, the graves are worse? Because the acid rain was actually cleaning all of the gravestones. Was it you who said that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Within the past 40 years, since the air has become much cleaner, the lichens have just sort of exploded all over a lot of the old slates, the granite, and
so let's all go back to polluting again, okay?
Yeah, it takes a lot of elbow grease to get those lichens off there.
You've probably heard of the Stetson family, very big founders of, you know, the first European settlers to come up the North River. And this is just a couple of members of the Stetson family at First Parish. Okay, so this is actually the Tory family grave, and this is the Tory family plot. And what's fascinating about this is you can see this little, very short stone wall, and then there's these little circles every so often on the wall. There used to be monuments, little statues. So Mr. Tory was a marble exporter. He lived in Italy, and his family were shipbuilders, and he wanted to make sure they had the best burial plot at First Parish Cemetery. So he created all of these little pieces that all went around that whole perimeter of the burial plot, and they're gone. We have records they were there. We know what they were. They're very specific records. There was hope and charity and love, and they're all gone. And we have no idea where they are. This was a young man who was playing Franklin Tory, who was the marble exporter, at the First Parish Comes Alive Cemetery Tour. So that's what I was alluding to earlier. So the Historical Society has been doing a cemetery tour for the last 3 years. We've got our 4th one coming up. I wrote the date down, Saturday, October 21st. So if you all can come, it is so much fun. You walk from person to person, or person who is portraying somebody that's buried there. So he portrayed Franklin Tory. I do believe Stephen will be playing somebody this year. Who are you playing?
Humphrey Turner.
Humphrey Turner. This is the Fogg family grave. Again, he was portrayed last year. The Foggs were bankers in town. They were presidents of, I think it was South Scituate Savings, and which was right in the center. And they really wanted to make a statement with their family stone. So go big or go home. They went big. And then this is Luther Tilden's stone, and Paul played Luther Tilden a few years ago in the tour. This is a gorgeous stone. It has, Luther Tilden was a shipbuilder, and so you could see the little hull of a ship up on blocks in the top of the on the top of the stone. This is fascinating. That's Eleanor Norris, as in the Norris Reservation, and that's Betsy Gordon playing Eleanor Norris a couple years ago. This is the old mill stone that used to be at the mill that was on the site of Norris Reservation. And it was used at first for Eleanor's husband, Albert, when he died in '62, and then she just died in 2012. She's buried there as well. John Cheever, famous author, Pulitzer Prize winner, Cheever Tavern. He was played actually twice, 2 years in a row, by the owner of Cheever Tavern, Mike Sheehan, who really liked playing him. And Stephen, you know what? I'm going to stop, even though I know the little gravestone, because I think you should probably talk about the Weeping Willow. And even though John Cheever only died in '82, he was a classic. And so he went for a classic stone.
Yeah, John Cheever is buried there with his parents, right next to, right near Cheever Tavern. I go talk to him all the time. The willow they have on there, and the type of stone is sort of replicating earlier, late 18th, early 19th century stones. After the Revolution, neoclassical imagery came in and became popular on gravestones, so that's when you get the urn and willow design. Even though willows weren't even found around here at that time, they had to be imported. But the weeping willow became a common image on needlework samplers, on engravings, on funeral tickets, any sort of notice in the newspaper of somebody dying. You'll often have a little willow with it or a coffin. So it's kind of funny that Cheever and his parents chose to sort of replicate the much older style of gravestones, this sort of headboard shape with the sort of modified willow design.
Mm. Oh, this is a classic. Okay, so working with First Parish Cemetery Association, the Historical Society walked around with members of that group to decide which graves are priority to be redone, to be cleaned up. And Janet Watson and the Historical Society and me said, oh, this one's gotta be, it's broken. It's just broken right off. We gotta fix this one. And then Stephen told us that it's supposed to be like that. So take it away, Stephen, and show me how I'm so, I have no idea.
They were quite in a tizzy. It's broken, we gotta fix it, we gotta put the top back on the column. But this is actually designed this way. In the 19th century, monument makers, memorial makers, quarries had a whole variety. I mean, they were literally like Sears catalogs for what type of monument you could erect. Now this was the time when you would have a family monument. So, the names of Tory or Fogg would be very prominent on the main memorial. And then you would either list the people buried around in the family plot on the stone, or have smaller markers. But this design of a broken column replicates the ruins in Italy and Greece, which were very popular as inspiration for designs in the 19th century, neoclassical designs. And a broken column can symbolize somebody who died young, such as under the age of 21, which was quite common, but it's also sort of recalling, the ruins. Throughout Western Europe in the 18th, 19th century, they were creating follies, which would replicate Roman ruins or Greek ruins as a way to sort of, evoke ancient Rome or ancient Greece. So yeah, they were quite astounded.
We didn't fix it.
That it wasn't broken.
We didn't fix it. These are great stones here. And I wondered, Stephen, are they marble too? Because they look the same color as,
yes.
Okay, they look the same
marble.
color as the James stones. So this is Reverend William Fish and his wife, Anne, and the church is right there behind them. So he was the minister of the parish from 1865 to 1885. He is the man who wrote to Josiah James and asked for money, and the James Library is there today, really in large part because of Reverend Fish. This is a great stone, and this has been cleaned. It's Charles Granderson and his wife Harriet. They were black people that lived, a black couple that lived on Mount Blue Street. Charles was the grandson of Cuffy. If you know Cuffy's Lane Reservation and Cuffy's Hill, Cuffy was a slave. He was enslaved by, I'm sorry, and it's escaping me right now, but the man that lived on Mount Blue Street, and he went and served in the Revolutionary War, and when he came back, he was granted land by his former owner. And so that's Charles's grandfather, Cuffy. And so the Granderson family continued to live on that land on Mount Blue Street. And I just mentioned Reverend Fish and his grave. So when Charles died in 1878, Reverend Fish wrote the following about him in his diary. Attended the funeral of Mr. Charles Grandison, colored, age 73 years, and a remarkable man for one of his position. Industrious, honest, upright in his relation, a man universally respected. He was a reverend and religious man also, and continued a member of the parish, a paying member to the end, though not able to attend church, a reproof of many white members who leave the parish to avoid the small tax assessed upon them. I love that. That's great. So yeah, it's a beautiful stone, and actually First Parish Cemetery Association had it redone, cleaned up a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to have Stephen talk a little bit about the process. I think we have a couple pictures, Stephen, of some of the repaired stones.
Okay. What you see here are early slate stones, 18th century stones. These are from a local quarry somewhere along the North River. This sort of dark purplish slate was used by the Vinyl family and by the first and second North River carvers, and you can see sort of local designs on them. They're kind of creepy, actually. They're almost like masks. The carvers who were local weren't as skilled as Boston carvers to make a winged skull, so they made these sort of abstract designs and created local styles. Now this one, like I said, it's slate. It's not as geologically mature as slate that you see up in Boston, which a lot of those came from Slate Island off in the harbor right by Hingham. So these ones are a little softer, making it easier to carve. And then you get even softer as you get to gravestones down in Plimpton, Middleborough, that area. But you can see how it's been on the left. You can see where it's separating. Slate is nothing but compressed mud that has solidified. That's why it flakes off so easily, and you can use it for, using with chalk, little slates for school or slate on roofs, and it makes great gravestones because it can be smoothed down. But you get some dirt, some ice in there for a couple centuries, standing out in a field in New England, and they'll start to flake off. So what's happened here is they've been encased by a material on top. With conservation of gravestones, it's gone through many iterations over the years, from literally putting them into granite, to putting copper covers on them, to putting epoxy on the back. Whatever happens, so long as it doesn't destroy any of the original material of the gravestone, it's usually pretty good. So but you can see how it's just sort of sealed up the top, so no more ice and dirt will be able to get in
And
there.
if you want to go ahead, I think there was another one after this that, a couple more of the, and this is a beautiful one, like Stephen was talking about. So we got the lichen off of it. But this one has the willow, doesn't it, at top?
Yeah, this is, you can see
Or an urn, I can't see.
1815, and it has both an urn and a willow. The original gravestones, 18th century, are sort of shaped literally like headboards and footboards of a bed, symbolic of going to sleep, basically. You get the big headstone and the small footstone. That continues into the 19th century, so you see a small one next to this one, but they still have that generic shape. By this time, the slates are no longer being hand quarried, they're run through a machine mill, so they're nice and smooth, very regular. And they would be carved, and then you'd send out the blank to a local carver, and he would just put in the name. But you can see the urn and willow up here, you can see some decorations down around the side. You get the epitaph with the name, and then usually a poem or something down below it. And it even, if you look right down by the grass, that's probably the name of the memorial maker or marker. A lot of times these gravestones have a lot of information on them, including the maker, where they came from, who carved it, sometimes even the price tag down below. So they're really fascinating.
I think this was another repaired one. I'm not sure. Here we go. Oh, this is the earliest stone that they have there. So this says, "Here lies ye body of Mrs. Mary Bryant, wife of Mr. Thomas Bryant, who died November the 30th, 1724, and in her arms doth lie ye corpse of two lovely babes, born of her 8 days before her death, one a son, Nathaniel, died ye day before her, a daughter named Hannah died a few hours after her." So I actually played Mary Bryant the first cemetery tour, and it was a tough one to try to make that a happy story. She actually did live. She lived a great life. She lived in the Bryant Cushing house, which is off of Main Street in Norwell, right in the center. She married Thomas and had a few kids before she had these twins, and she and the twins died. But then her husband did go on to marry another woman who raised the kids. They had more children and they lived a long life, and I tried to focus on that. That was a tough one to play, actually. We do try to make it a fun tour. So I just wanted to show here, again, Stephen was talking about so many of them are slate, which is, a stone that is easily splits. So there are a lot more stones that need to be repaired at First Parish.
I want to talk about those.
What?
You had little gravestones.
I did? Oh, sorry. Stephen
okay.
wants to talk about these. I didn't notice my little gravestone.
That little gravestone's for me.
Sorry, that's for him.
This is a perfect example of one of the earliest types of gravestones found around here. In the 17th century, graves were marked either with wooden markers, which obviously would not last very long in a New England field, but also with field stones. If you ever go down to the Winslow Burying Ground down in Marshfield, you will see pairs of field stones, and those mark graves. Chances are a lot of the oldest burying grounds had those, but over the years people have forgotten that that was used to mark graves and have been moved around. This type here represents what's being carved locally. And you can see that up top is a winged skull, but it's not like the really sort of realistic skulls or the beautifully carved wings on graves up in Boston, but it's a local design, and it keeps up with, becomes very popular among families. Here we've got Lincoln. You can go through, Scituate all the way into Hanover and see stones of this type. And these are all fairly small from the early period. Mary Bryant, of course, is an amazing gravestone. Half of all gravestones before 1800 throughout New England are technically for children, for people under the age of 21. Death, disease through fevers, took its toll on children prior to the 19th century. But also I want to draw your attention to the language. Here lies the body of. It's a very sort of immediate, very raw language. When you looked at a gravestone like this, you were supposed to be reminded of your own mortality. And the term itself they were always referred to as the burial place or the burying ground. real immediate language. After the Revolution, all of that's going to change, and then you'll have epitaphs starting in memory of. And that's when the term cemetery comes in, meaning city of sleepers, much more sort of sentimentalized. You go from burying somebody in a coffin to burying them in a casket. A casket was a term for a medieval jewel box. So it's this sort of real fundamental shift between the colonial type of stones and the more modern American stones of the 19th century.
So we're going to move on to the next cemetery, which is Bowker Cemetery. It's a little unknown. Probably most of you don't even know it exists. It's off of Bowker Street in Norwell. It's heavily overgrown. It's sort of at the Grove Street end. This is what it looks like from the road. There is a single monument in it. It's only about 50 by 200 feet. And even this stone, there is one headstone still visible, sort of, and it's badly damaged. But the most noticeable feature, obviously, is this large monument dedicated to Elijah Bowker and his children. And I have a close-up of what it says. So his wife was Annie Sylvester, and it just lists the children. We're not sure if anybody is buried there. We think the Bowkers are buried there. We don't have a lot of good records. There's really not markings. We know it's a monument to the family, at least, but we're not sure. We're not positive. There were a lot of Bowker houses along Bowker Street and that end of Grove Street. So that one's a little bit, it's a small cemetery. And then the next one is Churchill Cemetery. So it is between Church Street, River Street, Tiffany Road, and Common Ave. It's sort of, that's the entrance to it with those cones. It's kind of, goes way up on the hill. It was established in 1725. It's located in that area, those many streets that I just mentioned, and the oldest section is right near River Street. It was originally established as a private burial ground for the Palmer family that lived on Tiffany Road, and then it also includes other graves of many shipbuilders. So the Stetsons, the Torys, the Winslows. I'll stop right there, Stephen. And then also Captain Thomas Stetson, who is Norwell's only veteran of the War of 1812, is buried here in 1838. I couldn't find a stone, though. And then Stephen's going to talk a little bit on the next slide about the Celtic cross, which marks where St. Andrew's Episcopal Church was.
Okay. Here you see the classic urn and willow design. You'll see this on dozens of stones in most of the cemeteries, burying grounds around here from the early 19th century. You can see the older types and the different materials. The one to the right of Mr. Stetson there, that's a big purple granite marker. There was the Pratt family over in Abington. For about 6 generations, they carved gravestones, and they have these massive purple stones, and you'll see them all around, from Hingham down to Plimpton, all around here. They're really big. Hanover has an amazing collection of them. Here you see for Bethia Howland, consort of Jacob Howland. Consort is the term for the second wife of a minister. So whenever you see consort on a stone like that.
That was a big question I had for Stephen. I said, okay. I called him from the graveyard and said, I just found a gravestone for a consort.
Yeah, whenever the rest of the Historical Society are in a cemetery and they've got a question, I always get a text or a phone call, no matter where I am. And the Celtic cross here marks the spot of the original location of St. Andrews, the parish. St. Andrews, since 1811, has been in Four Corners over in Hanover. But prior to that, it was up on top of Church Hill, right there off River Road. St. Andrews is interesting because it's like the 3rd or 4th Church of England congregation in Massachusetts. It's one of the oldest. And it was established, right here on Church Hill, probably because of so many of the shipbuilders who were moving around and coming into the North River area. So the original church building was built right on top of the church, and this cross now marks the location of where the church was.
Stephen referred to earlier various methods over the years of ways that people have tried to restore gravestones. So Stephen, do you want to talk about this very strange method, encasing it in concrete?
Concrete or encasing them in granite was done. If you go up on Burial Hill in Plymouth, which is one of the most amazing burying grounds in New England, you'll see that the stones have many of them have been cut down and placed inside granite and mortared in there. This was done with concrete here, so you can see the stone sort of set in these little recesses. The problem is the concrete and the granite are much harder materials. Slate, as compressed mud, swells and shrinks ever so slightly. And over the course of time, the past century or so since this was done, they've started to buckle and crack. So eventually these will just sort of pop right out. I've witnessed this actually happening down on Burial Hill with some stones, because I'm like a complete geek. I've been going up there for 30 plus years. But this was an early attempt to try to preserve some of those early gravestones. Another
interesting method of preservation, and that's with air quotes, at Churchill is apparently there was a gentleman who lived in the Churchill area near the cemetery who manufactured clear plastic. And so there are other gravestones that actually have plastic coverings over them. And when I went up to take photographs, there were plants. It's like a greenhouse growing all up inside the plastic, and it's all wet inside there as well. And I thought, I think that was another phone call. I said, oh my gosh, Stephen, who did this? And not recommended, also, not recommended. Okay, and I'm going to move on to, I don't know why my titles aren't working here, but so this is the entry to the Jacobs Collimore Cemetery, another small cemetery you probably didn't know about. So if you know where Jacobs Trail is, across from Stop and Shop there's a light, and if you go straight across, that is Jacobs Trail. Immediately after you go through that stoplight on the left, between Wendell and Doris Ave, is this little tiny graveyard. It used to have a lot more graves in it. And so between 1780 and 1913, members of the Jacobs and Collimore families, who all lived in that Assinippie area, were buried at this site. And until recently, there were actually no visible headstones, just this big commemorative stone on the site. And then in 2012, 3 Jacobs gravestones that were previously at the cemetery, because we did have records of it, were placed again at the site. They were found. People contacted the Historical Society. One was found in the bottom of a trunk that was delivered to us from Florida. And I've heard, Glenn Ferguson was telling me that when they were repaving the road there and grinding things down, they actually could see gravestones at the base of the road. So people were, and that, I'm going to have Stephen talk about that. Because I said, I think it's mean, and Stephen said, well...
It was done quite frequently. I've been lecturing and talking about cemeteries and graveyards for about 30 years now, and I've always met people, oh, well, we've got one in the basement in the barn, or, oh, we've got a flagstone out back, yeah. One woman called me up in a complete frenzy over in Hanover. I found gravestones under my pool cabana. Does that mean somebody's there? No, a lot of times in the 18th, 19th century, people saw these as just good stones already quarried that they would use. If you go to King's Chapel Burying Ground up in Boston, right in the center, next to King's Chapel, right in the middle of it is a big green stone for William Paddy. He was an early settler and inhabitant of Plymouth. He died in 1658, and his stone is this thick, like green marker. It was found in 1830 under the foundation of the old State House, when they were first digging below the old State House, and it was replaced there. There were stories of a gravestone was used in a bread oven in one of the old North End bakeries, and for years people would get part of an epitaph sort of cooked into the bottom of their loaves of bread. This happened quite frequently, for a lot of workers or whomever, they just grabbed the stones. So there are lots of stories like that.
So these are the 3 gravestones that have been put back. And honestly, have they been put back in the proper location? Probably not. I literally said to the guy that was putting them in, this one will look good here, I think that looks good there. I mean, I was kind of on my own on that one, but I think they look great where they are. And they are all members of the Jacobs family. Oh, that's a great one. That's Mary Jacob. So Stephen, I have a little note, I have my little gravestone, so if you want to mention anything about these. Oh, that's beautiful angel face, actually.
Yeah, there's a great example of the sort of local cherub face or angel face design. Those are popular from about the 1750s to about 1780s. A lot of times there are variations on those with little portraits, not actual portraits of people, but little stylized images of men or women on the gravestones. This is a classic one. You can see how the change in fashion from the slate of the late 18th, early 19th century to the 19th century marble right here. Was this the one that?
Yep, those are the 3.
The 3, yeah. Dr. Joseph Jacob, there you can see that wonderful sort of happy, smiling angel face, a lot more hopeful than that winged skull. I like the winged skulls myself, but, and here you can see, how it's much simpler than some other elaborate ones.
Yep.
Do you have the,
There are only 3 there.
remember the other one you called me up about related to
Oh,
these?
Mary Webb. No, she doesn't belong there.
Okay.
We'll have
All
her
right.
in a second. So
Okay.
can you forward me
Yep.
to the Pinehurst Cemetery? So this is another cemetery. This is across from Churchill Cemetery, sort of. It's right there off of River Street. And it is currently in use. They're still doing burials there. It's privately owned. So this is Common Ave that runs through it right there. It's fairly small. It's only about 500 feet by 500 feet, and it's different levels. It's very interesting. It's kind of graduated. It was established in 1870, and this is great, after a feud between several families in the Church Hill Association, and so they set up their own cemetery across the street. If you could go forward. In addition to the graves, there are also 5 tombs that contain the remains of, one more, Stephen, sorry, Barstow, Copeland, Pratt, and Stetson families. So those are all the shipbuilding families of the North River. And I think I took a couple of pictures of other stones that you might want to talk about. Oh, this is the Tolman, so the whole family is buried in there, and they've enclosed it. It's beautiful. I love the gate, too. I thought that was really pretty. And I love those Gothic marble stones, Stephen. And then if you want to go to the next one, I think I have a couple more here. Oh, yeah, those are those up close, yeah.
Here you can see some of those imagery. You got a stylized willow tree, and this is 1858, but that one, it's a shock of wheat that's been cut, so obviously tying into old images of Father Time with his scythe, chopping down a flower or a shock of wheat. Cool, little church.
Oh, and these are some more. These are more Stetson family members that are up there, yeah. And let's see what else we have. Oh, and this one I loved. So Josiah Stoddard. This one I thought was fascinating. It's not even an old grave. He's buried in 1965. And did we find out about Von Beetle and why he has, or do you have anything to
I don't remember.
Contribute to that? But it's a log, if you can tell. I just thought that was a great stone. Okay, and now we're moving on to Second Parish Cemetery. So this is probably our earliest this is our earliest graveyard in town. It's the one off of Main Street that just looks tumble down. So if you're driving towards Scituate on the right-hand side, and it's really overgrown by weeds. It's between Rewbound and Trunnell. But it is beautiful, beautiful cemetery. It's not small. It's 50 by about 300 feet, but unfortunately there's lots of poison ivy, so I wouldn't recommend going at this time of year. But many of the stones are unreadable. Some have been vandalized or just fallen down. and are in disrepair. The site for the burial ground was actually originally owned by Timothy Foster. He was a shipbuilder in 1680, and it was also the site for the second church of Scituate, so First Parish, Norwell. This was the site of their original one was down the street across from Stephen's house at the end of Old Meeting House Lane, and this was the second site of the church, and then they moved it to Norwell Center. But it does contain some of the earliest stones in town, including William Barrow's stone dating back to 1689. Go ahead, Stephen.
I took that photo. Yeah, this is one of the earliest dated stones along the whole North River. There's only a handful of stones dated prior to 1700 throughout all of the South Shore, and this is one of them. And you can see how it's just pretty straightforward, very simple. There's no elaborate carvings. It's just the epitaph there. So 1689, here lies the body of William Barrows, who died November the 7th, 1689, aged 35 years. A lot of times, it's interesting, the carver might not have been completely literate, so somebody wrote it out for him and he was just carving it in. There's one poor carver from Marshfield, I think he was dyslexic because all his N's are backwards. But it's really sort of interesting, they combine the T and the H, wonderful carvings. And you can see the sort of different varieties. This one on the right for Timothy Foster has these wonderful swirls down the side with the stylized skull. That one over there has a wonderful neoclassical urn, and then there's a willow sort of all the way up around it. From 1815?
1815, yeah.
It's actually not as overgrown anymore.
Okay, good.
It has been cleared out. Somebody has taken an interest in preserving his ancestors' burying ground, so it's nowhere near as overgrown as it had been. Here you can see a couple more varieties of stones. On the right is one of those little portrait stones that I was telling you about. So you get, for men, you would have the little head with the little peruke, the wig. For women, it's often just a little hood. Some of these can be very elaborate. If it's a minister, they might show them, from the waist up, and you can see details like the buttons and buttonholes on the waistcoat. These are so well carved. Yeah. Here are some of these local designs. You can see an angel face on the far left. And what's the date on that, Wendy? Is that 1770s or 80s?
1717, it looks like to me. It's hard to see. Oh, no, 1791. I'm sorry.
That was close. I know my stones. 1791. A lot of them carved, at the time of the Revolution and just afterwards. These were very anxious times, so a lot of the faces sort of reflect that. There's no smiles on these angel faces. They look pretty grim. These ones are the earlier designs. You can see Samuel Oakman. Those stylized skulls start getting really sort of funky at this time, but this is the local pattern, and you can see they're almost like these masks, kind of like Muppet masks.
Yeah.
And you see this wherever there's a local outcropping of granite in the 18th, 19th century, you get local gravestone carvers. If you go up to Lexington, Concord, you look at the burying grounds up there, you see what looks like, almost African masks or Celtic masks on them. And these ones, you get some down in towards Plimpton and Middleborough with like wavy hair. They look like Medusas. I mean, they're really sort of striking when you see them. Some more of the examples of the carvings on there.
Was that the one where it was the relic?
Yes, relic.
What does that mean?
Widow of somebody.
Okay.
Who hadn't remarried.
Terms we don't use anymore. Okay, and this is one of my personal favorite cemeteries because I live down the street from it. It's actually called the Stockbridge Cemetery. It's right off of, if you go down School Street and you hit Mount Blue and have to take a right or a left, it's right there in front of you. It is very well maintained. It's actually owned by the town of Norwell now, so it's maintained by the town. The cemetery is the family burial ground of the Stockbridges, who are buried on the west side of the cemetery, and the Stoddards, who are on the east side. I don't think it's a situation of like Hatfield and McCoy. I think just that's how geographically it worked out. And other notable families are the Litchfields, the Turners, and the Williamsons, all of whom were descendants of the Stockbridges, and they all lived in the Mount Blue area. The earliest stone dates back to 1758, although I could not find it. I looked everywhere. And a portion of the cemetery is elevated and kind of mounded and surrounded by stone walls. And this is actually the final resting place of 6 Revolutionary War soldiers. And they were all members of the Stockbridge family. And then, Stephen, if you could go forward one more. This is a really interesting, so it's Memorial to Meshach Litchfield and his son Ben, who were lost at sea on August 16th, 1846. So obviously they're not buried there, but it looks like Mrs. Litchfield, Temperance, is buried there. So it serves as both a marker for her grave, but also a memorial to her husband and her son who were lost at sea. And then next we have the second church at Wilson Hill. No, this is Washington Street Cemetery. I'm sorry, Washington Street Cemetery. My titles are gone, so I'm a little confused. We drive by Washington Street all the time, and we really don't think of it as a historic cemetery. It's active, it's owned by the town, there's burials happening monthly there, but it was actually founded in 1892. So the town of Norwell purchased 19 acres of land from the Jacobs family, and upon completion of the layout of the front part of the cemetery, burials started in 1893, and a soldier's monument was placed at the entrance. And lots at that time cost $10 and $20, and originally anybody could purchase lots, but eventually ownership became restricted to residents in the town. And then when the Southeast Expressway was built in the mid-1900s, it went right through the middle of the 19-acre site, but people had not been buried there yet. So it made the back half of the cemetery unreachable, so unusable. And Stephen, if you could go forward. Yeah, so Collimore and Farrar, very famous names in town, Farrar Farm Road. And Collimore, there's a Damon on there. We know Damon's Way. And then if you go forward one more, Stephen, there's a memorial to Willard Robinson at the entrance to the cemetery. He was a Civil War veteran who died in Andersonville Prison. It was a prisoner of war camp. And he was I'm going to read a little something about him. He was 17 years old. He was a bootmaker when he and his father, David Robinson, enlisted together in 1863. They were captured at Plymouth, North Carolina in 1864 and sent to the notorious Andersonville prison and offered a chance to go out to work. David Robinson, who was Willard's father, refused, and he was reputed to have said, "The boy and I may die, but we will never desert the cause." In September, father and son were among the first prisoners to be moved to a prison in Florence, South Carolina, which had been hastily built due to General Sherman's advance towards Andersonville, and conditions at the new prison were so harsh, and there weren't enough blankets or rations to feed and shelter the prisoners. So it was only in operation for about 6 months. It held about 15,000 soldiers, and 2,800 of those soldiers died. And shortly after arrival, David and his son Willard, David awoke to find his son had passed away during the night, and David was refused permission to bury his son's body, and he could only spread a handkerchief over the face of his son. David Sr., the father, was later exchanged as a prisoner of war and returned to South Scituate, and he lived to be 92, and he was able to see the GAR Hall off of High Street, which was the Grand Army of the Republic. It was sort of a VFW hall for Civil War soldiers. He was able to see it built and dedicated in memory of his son. And then there are 2 historic graveyards that you can't see anymore, and they don't even have any stones. So the first one is right across. It has a marking stone right across from Stephen's house, actually. It's called the Second Church at Wilson Hill Graveyard. I do believe that is why Stephen bought his house where he did, because it was right across the street.
I actually didn't know that was there. It was just sort of very much a good coincidence.
So it's on the corner of Old Meeting House Lane and Main Street. It was established in 1644, so this is truly the oldest graveyard in town. The meeting house for Second Parish, we talked about its second location at the other graveyard. So this was its first location. It was here from about 1645 to 1680. And in the early 1800s, the gravestones were removed. We just have no traces. And 2 years later, some stones were found. One belonged to Thomas King, who died in 1691, and the other belonged to Cornelius Briggs, who died in 1694. And the Tory, Hatch, and Robinson families were among the notable families buried there. But this is an older photo of that. But Stephen, if you go forward one, this is what it looks like today. So that stone is just there right off of Main Street. And that's all that's left of the graveyard. Do you want to say anything about it, or?
I'm thinking the bodies are in my front yard.
We don't quite know.
There's somewhere around there. This stone, I think, was erected around 1900, 1902, about a decade after those last stones were sort of removed.
Yeah.
And that older photo, you should see, it was just nothing but a field.
Yeah.
And now, of course, Old Meeting House Lane, has a bunch of houses down there.
Yeah. And so the second graveyard that you probably don't know exists. So this is a picture of the woods where we believe it exists. It's off of River Street. If you know where Blackthorn Lane is, off of River Street. It's the old Quaker Cemetery. We believe it's located in this location. It was sort of close to Wanton Shipyard. We do know that. And the original location of Wanton Shipyard is sort of at the end of Blackthorn Lane. There's inexact written documentation indicating its location on higher ground in a pine grove. I mean, not super descriptive. And the cemetery was at the location of the old Quaker Meeting House. So there used to be a Quaker Meeting House on River Street. And the burial ground had stones as early as 1661, so very old. And that was when John Rogers and his wife were interned there. So in 1899, local historian George Turner, so again, written in 1899, he wrote about the cemetery in these lovely, they're just beautiful, hand-lettered little newsletters that he wrote. And he talked about the cemetery, and he noted at the time that only one stone remains, that of Mary Webb. And that stone actually resides at the Jacobs Farmhouse in one of the barns right now. And we don't quite know what to do with it. I don't want to put it randomly in the woods somewhere off of Blackthorn Lane. So there it is, the Mary Webb stone. And what is the date on that stone?
1708.
1708. So, yeah, and it was there in 1899, according to George Turner. So.
And you can tell this is a Quaker stone because on Quaker stones up until mid-19th century, they didn't use the names of the months or days. Notice it says 23rd D for 23rd day, 8MO for 8 month.
Oh, fascinating.
If you go over to the Quaker burying ground around the Quaker Meeting House in North Pembroke, you'll see all the stones just have numbers for what month, what day, that's it.
Okay, so Stephen, the next one is the Damon Cemetery. So if you know the intersection of Prospect and Grove Street, there's a little cut-through neighborhood called Damon Way, and this is off of it's off of Damon Way, not Damon Lane, and it's back there in the woods. You can walk up to it. The Damon family lived in that area, hence the name Damon Way. And the graveyard has stones for members of the Brown, Damon, and Northey families. I think I have, and it's not a terribly old looking stone, Stephen. 1874, 1846. Mm-hmm. But it looks like a fairly modern stone as far as I can tell. And then if you go to the next, so throughout Norwell, we actually have a couple of small private tombs and a couple of scattered graveyards. So this is, if you click forward, you'll see a bigger picture, the Cushing Tomb. So I don't know if anybody drives down Old Oaken Bucket on a regular basis, and you may have noticed they've done a lot of work on it. So the Historical Commission, not the Society, asked for some CPA money from the town, and the town granted it to clear some trees around this old vault. So in talking, when I was creating the brochure, and talking with Gertrude Danow, she does not believe there are any bodies in there. She believes that they were removed by the Cushing family. I'm just telling you what she said. And then they sealed up the door because the door was actually able to be opened, and the neighborhood boys kept getting in it. And the neighborhood boys were Skip Joseph and his friends. And I can say that because Skip is no longer with us, but that's what Gertrude told me. So anyway, I don't believe that actually Joseph is buried there, but he did live in the immediate area on Old Oaken Bucket. Why did he want a tomb across from his house? I don't know. Go ahead, Stephen. There's also, does everybody know where the reserve is off of Pleasant Street? And the reserve is sort of horseshoe shaped, and in the middle of that horseshoe is the old Otis house, the Ephraim Otis estate. And there is a small burial ground on the Ephraim Otis estate, and they were Shakers as well, I believe. So they're it's very small, but that's on private property, so we can't go see that. And then my favorite line from, I should have said that when I was talking about the Otis estate. This is my favorite line from the brochure. In earlier times, it was customary to bury one's kindred on the family estate, and a number of private burial grounds and tombs still exist in town. I love that. Customary to bury one's kindred on the family estate. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.